Good afternoon. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and this is a significant day at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of two reports on the war in Ukraine, our own hiding in plain sight, Putin's war in Ukraine, and then the exclusive English language release of Boris Nemtsov's Putin's War. And so we look forward to rolling out both of these reports for you today, which I think when you take them together will ensure that Putin's secret war in Ukraine, or at least secret among some, is no longer secret. I want to offer a special welcome to our audience watching online, especially those in Ukraine and Russia who've tuned into our live website or webcast at night. I encourage everyone to join our conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #PutinAtWar. We will be hearing remarks both in English and in Russian today. For those in the audience here at the Atlantic Council, turn your headsets to Channel 2 for English and to Channel 1 for Russian. At the Atlantic Council, we are acutely aware that the ongoing war in Ukraine's east is not just about Ukraine. It's about the global order, it's about the future of Europe whole and free, and it's about the future of Russia itself. The men and women on the front lines of Ukraine are not just defending themselves, they are defending the rules of international engagement that have delivered security and stability in Europe since the end of the Cold War. That's why in February 2014, the Council launched its Ukraine in Europe initiative. This initiative galvanizes international support for an independent Ukraine that chooses its own destiny within secure borders, whose people within secure borders. The Council's work aims to strengthen Ukraine's security, preserve its territorial integrity, and advance democratic, economic, and governance reforms. I'd first like to recognize those who have supported this initiative from the start. George Chapivsky and the Chapivsky Family Foundation, Ambassador Julie Finley, Frontera Resources, Ian Inatovich and Marta Witter, Lena Kosharny and Horizon Capital, James Temerity, the Smith Richardson Foundation, George Lund, who helped us gain support from throughout the Atlantic Council Board, and the Ukraine World Congress led by President Eugene Cholai and Vice President Paul Grod. And Paul, it's great to have you here today from Canada. Against the backdrop of this mission, our conversation today focuses on a central question in the Ukraine crisis, and that is the Kremlin's role in the conflict. These reports, taken together, argue that the war's toll, more than 6,000 dead, tens of thousands wounded, and nearly 1.3 million displaced persons are the direct result of Vladimir Putin's decisions and actions. Since the beginning of the crisis, the Kremlin has been waging a highly sophisticated hybrid war involving subversion, Russian leadership of armed groups, Russian weapons, Russian money, Russian propaganda, and regular Russian troops. All the while, Vladimir Putin insists that Russia is not involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Some take this claim at face value. Many hear contradictory information and don't know what is true. The purpose of these reports is to shed light on this deception. The reports were produced independently of each other, but reach the same conclusions, and that is Putin's Russia is at war with Ukraine. The Atlantic Council report, Hiding in Plain Sight, Putin's War in Ukraine, provides evidence exposing Russia's military involvement in Ukraine's east, drawing on publicly available information. It chronicles the full spectrum of the Kremlin's war in Ukraine's east, drawing on publicly available information. It chronicles the full spectrum of the Kremlin's war in Ukraine using open source investigative techniques. It reveals how Russia's military equipment moves into Ukraine, where training camps have been built on the border, and pinpoints the Russian origins of cross-border artillery attacks on Ukraine territory. As Michael Gordon wrote about the report in this morning's New York Times, quote, and this is from Michael Gordon's piece, in an attempt to puncture the Russian denials, independent experts have operated like digital Sherlock Holmeses, using Google Street View, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, satellite photographs, and Russia's version of Facebook, including social media updates by Russian soldiers. That research was then supplemented by more traditional sources like court documents and local media reports. The analysis in the report uses innovative social media forensics and geolocation methodology, pioneered by one of the co-authors of the report, Elliot Higgins. Elliot couldn't join us in person today, but we'll see him on video. The report was the direct result of a collaborative effort between the Atlantic Council's Executive Vice President, Damon Wilson, Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center Director, Ambassador John Herbst, Associate Director Alina Polyakova, and my own Special Assistant Max Chupersky. Very proud of your work on this, Max, as well as over a dozen volunteer researchers and interns who spent hours fact-checking the report. And we'll hear from the co-authors momentarily. It's a great privilege to also be joined by the team that gathered Boris Nemtsov's evidence of Putin's war in Ukraine after the opposition leader was slain in view of the Kremlin on February 27th, 2015, and anybody who spent time in Moscow knows exactly the spot on the bridge where that took place. At great risk to their own freedom and livelihood, the team tracked down what was left of Mr. Nemtsov's report and published it in Moscow 2 weeks ago. Today, we honor Mr. Nemtsov's legacy with the release of the official English version of Putin's War. On June 12th, we will honor Boris Nemtsov again, and the memory of Boris Nemtsov, with an Atlantic Council Freedom Award at the Wrocław Global Forum in Poland, and that award will be presented by Gary Kasparov. Two of the report's authors and opposition leaders, Ilya Yashin and Leonid Martynuk, traveled from Russia to be with us here today, and we're delighted to have them here. Thank you so much for making the trip, and we look forward to hearing from you. Before I invite them to the stage to present the report, though, I do want to read just the first couple of lines from the foreword that Damon and I wrote for the report, because this is so important, because what can sometimes be misunderstood when we take on these issues is that somehow this is anti-Russian, or somehow we're doing this against Russia. Let me read the 2 lines. For 25 years, prominent members of the Atlantic Council community have worked to advance the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, in which Russia enjoys its peaceful place. In fact, many in our community aspired not only for a strategic partnership with Russia, but envisioned an alliance between Russia and NATO, contributing to international stability and security. And that remains the vision of many of us at the Atlantic Council as a medium-term and long-term goal. Unfortunately, Russian President Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine today mock this vision and threaten the international order established at the end of the Cold War. So we do this work not against Russia, but actually for the international community, for a Europe whole and peace, for Ukraine, and ultimately also for Russia. With that, let me pass the floor to Mr. Yashin and Mr. Martynuk.
Да нет, все в порядке. Здравствуйте, уважаемые.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to see you, and thank you for coming up. With your permission, I would like to give you bad news that we received from Moscow before we start talking about the report. I would like to tell you that in Moscow, our ally Vladimir Karamurza is in a very bad health. His body is actually, he's now in induced coma, and there is a suspicion that Vladimir was poisoned, and actually his organs are failing. Vladimir is one of the most active abolitionist. He lived in the United States for a long time. About a year ago or half a year ago, he came back to Russia and he started to be very active in opposition. He became the member of the bureau of our party. He is in charge of some election projects on behalf of Mr. Khodorkovsky. Most likely he was poisoned. And the detail is that Vladimir Kara-Murza turned to be in the hospital on the day, 3 months after the death of Boris Nemtsov to the day. And the symbolism of this date is unbelievable. I would like to tell you about this story in order to attract your attention to the destiny of Vladimir. We wish him health. We hope that he will get better, even though he is in a very bad, very poor health. I hope that Leonid will agree with me that I want this episode to be known everywhere, not only in Russia, but in the whole world. 3 months ago, our friend died, Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was one of the brightest oppositionists in Russia. He was one of the most charismatic Russian politicians, and Nemtsov was a great Russian patriot. At the same time, Nemtsov loved Ukraine unconditionally. He loved the language, the people, the culture of Ukraine. Nemtsov was concerned about the war that Putin initiated between our countries. Nemtsov was a person of peace, and he tried to repair the relations between our countries. Nemtsov wanted to tell the Russian society about this crime, and even though it was war. And that was the idea behind putting the Putin War report. Before his death, Nemtsov started to work on this report. He got his own sources. He put together the plan of this report and started to work on it actively. He didn't have a chance to finish this work. On February 27th, 2015, he was killed next to Kremlin's wall, about 100 meters from the residency of Putin. He was shot into his back, and until now, nobody identified the criminals or those who ordered the killing. We understand that while Putin is in the Kremlin, those who ordered the killing will be free. We would like to make sure that the fight that Nemtsov was fighting and gave up his life to be continued. And that's why all of our efforts were focused on continuing his work and finish his report, Putin War. In this report, we have strong evidence of the presence of the Russian troops in Ukraine. The report shows good evidence that during this year, Putin was lying to Russians that there are no Russian troops in Donbass. The easiest part for us was the Crimea part. And I would like to remind you that in March 2014, when the operation started in the Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, the Russian society heard from Putin that there is some self-defense forces there, and the Russian troops have nothing to do with it. But they said, well, those people have Russian uniforms with no insignia on it. And Putin would say, well, they probably bought it somewhere in the store. A year later, Putin's rhetoric changed cardinally. Putin admitted openly that that was Russian special forces, and that was a military operation that was under the command of Putin personally. And this information was broadcasted on the Russian TV. Putin admitted it openly on the TV. The head of one of the largest countries of the world with the nuclear potentials was publicly lying to his people and the whole world. And we want to focus the Russian society on this and show it to them. And if Putin was lying here, then he will lie in the future. We want to tell the Russians that Russia actually, and the Putin actually disregarded the international commitments of Russia. Russia made commitments to be a guarantor of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, paid for it a very high price. Not everybody remembers it. Within the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapon. The logic of this decision of our neighbors was understood and clear. Why do they need any nuclear power, nuclear weapon, if there is a neighbor on the east who is ready to come to help you at any time? Putin actually destroyed the reputation of our country by backstabbing Ukraine. And this is a cynical war. There is no closer people in the world to Russians than Ukrainians. And the fact that Putin hit them in the back is a shame for our country. Putin says that there are no Russian troops in Ukraine. We collected many testimonies and evidence of the Russian troops who participated personally in military actions there. I would like to give you several examples. This young man is a Russian parachutist, Nikolai Kozlov, airborne troop. In March 2014, he personally participated in blocking the sites in Crimea within the Crimean operation. And while he was the Russian military, he participated in the Crimean campaign wearing a Ukrainian policeman uniform. Here is the picture of him. After annexation of the Crimea, Kozlov came back home to Ulyanovsk city, where he received the medal for returning the Crimea. That's the picture with his medal on his chest. He had the time to get married after that and vacation. And in August 2014, he came back to Ukraine again. He was drafted within one of the units. He participated in suppression of the artillery fighting in Ukraine. He was shot at. He was shelled. He was within the troop that was shelled, and then he was wounded. His leg was amputated, and now he's a disabled veteran. This information we received thanks to the civic position of his uncle Sergei, who told us about the destiny of his nephew and gave us these pictures. The other example, the Russian tank armored man from Buryatia, Domonkuyev. He also participated in military operations near the village of Debaltsevo. He was seriously wounded, and here is his pictures in the Donetsk hospital. This is an active Russian military. He admitted his participation in fighting. One of the most important parts of the report is the equipment, the Russian equipment, and its use in fighting. The position of the separatists, is as follows. equipment that is used against the Ukrainian army is the trophy equipment that they were able to get during their fights, their battles. That's the lie. That's lie. But it is very hard to counter this lie because very often both Russian and Ukrainian troops would use the same type of military equipment. But there are some exceptions that helped us to identify the lies of the Kremlin and the separatists. We analyzed the text of Minsk agreement that was signed by both Putin and Poroshenko during their negotiations. And in Minsk negotiations, they state this Tornado S system. Military system. This is military equipment that was exclusively made only in Russia and has never been exported. There is only one country in the world that would have Tornado S system. It's Russia only. By signing the agreement, the Minsk agreement, where it states that Tornado S system has to be withdrawn from the territory of military actions, Putin actually, in documents, admitted that he transferred these systems to separatists. There is another example. We're talking about the system Panzer S-1. This is a missile system of the Russian product that was exported, but there was only one country that has that equipment, and it's neighboring Ukraine, and it's only Russia. During a long period of time, the separatists denied that they have Tornado S system and Panzer S-1 systems. But we were able to print in our report screenshot from video registrator where this system is shown next to the billboard with the pictures of separatists, of leaders of Lugansk and Donetsk and People's Republic. What other proofs do you need? We put together this report because we are patriots of Russia. Our goal is to defend national interests of Russia. We believe that the Putin's war in Ukraine is destructive for our country, both politically and economically and morally. This war is a shame of Russia, for Russia. That's why we, as Russian patriots, try to make sure that the war stops, and we are working on stopping it. And our goal is to deliver this information to the Russian society. But for us, it is also very important to make sure that the world also focuses on this war. Thank you. Leonid Martynuk. In the end of 2014, Boris Nemtsov paid attention to two interesting facts. According to the polling of public, most of Russians believe that Russians should not participate in the conflict of Donbass militarily. On the other hand, the majority of Russians believe that there are no Russian military troops in Donbass. At that time, he already thought that there is a need to provide this information to the majority of Russians, because if Russians, he believed, would learn that there were troops in Ukraine, Russian troops in Ukraine, and they're against it, then that would affect Putin's rating. Because it was very important for Putin, the weakest point is that he is following his rating very closely. The rating that we hear from officials, polling sociologists, probably is very far from realistic one, but he receives the real numbers. the realistic numbers. I put together the chapter, or restored the chapter about the Boeing shooting down and about Donbass. I'm talking that I restored that part because I tried to write that chapter based on the posts on Facebook made by Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov, on the first and second day after on July 17, 2014, the Boeing was shut down, he paid attention and he attracted the attention to the official information in Russian mass media. They noted that on the 17th of July, about Therese, about around 4 o'clock and 24, airplane was shut down. After it turned out to be that it was Boeing, the official mass media actually started to say the other information that was Boeing and nobody knows who shot it down. But in a few hours later, they started to inform Russians that Boeing was following similar to Putin's course, and probably somebody wanted to shut down Putin's airplane. And of course, who would that be? Those are Ukrainians. And then the fact that on Facebook there was a posting after a few minutes after 4 o'clock, somebody posted that they shut down a plane, and then later on there was another posting there that was an empty Boeing, and that was the conspiracy of the United States with the participation of Europeans. And then later on, in a few days, there was another unbelievable idea that was Ukrainian fighters, that they shut down that plane, and all of those ideas were supported by, for example, Ministry of Defense or other popular people like Mr. Leontiev on Channel 1. And they used even edited picture that Boeing was shut down by Ukrainian fighters. And today, if you talk to Russians, they do not remember what happened at the very first about the very first information or statement that was An-24 airplane. The current Russian society lives by the rules of our what was true yesterday, today is lie, and the other way around. And there is a good anecdote here, or story about it. Have you read the novel 1884? No, I haven't read it. I live in it. The fact is that the An-24 was shut down, and it was shut down by the separatists, was informed by mass media that didn't want to delete their information. You can go even to Itar-Tas right now and look into their archives. This is one of the largest state-owned Russian mass media agency. And on their sites, there is still information that at 4 p.m. An-24 was shut down about the village of Therese by separatists. They still, Life News TV channel had a story, and that story is still in their archives. And this Life News channel is very closely cooperating with separatists, and sometimes their journalists are confused with the separatists because they are dressed in the same uniform. Life News also gave information that there was airplane An-24 shut down right a few minutes after 4 p.m. And that separatists of pro-Russians or Russians, there are several versions there. I will not say who exactly was behind shooting it down, but the fact that separatists have something to do with it, with shooting down the Boeing, there are many evidence about it. In our report, we show major investigations, and they are described in chronological order, how it was done. done with all the investigation of these events, including journalists. There were also local citizens who were questioned. There were also identified the place where Book M system was used for shooting the plane down, and all of the information says that Book M system came from Russia and was made in Russia. And only recently, the official investigative group from the Netherlands, that included representatives from various countries that lost their citizens in this catastrophe, they stated that the most likely version is that the Boeing was shot down by Book M system that came from Russia. But it is important to provide this information to Russia. And they say, well, you got the truth. On July 14th, 2014, July 17th, 2014, you already got that information. Who is responsible for the death of those 298 people on board of Malaysian airline? I believe that it is very important that Boris Nemtsov started this idea. They had this idea, and his associate continued and implemented this idea. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President for Programs and Strategy here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Ilya. Leonid, thank you not only for your efforts to complete Boris Nemtsov's work, but for your own courage and leadership on these issues. I want to tip my hat to Natalia, who's with us, as well as Sergei Alexashenko, who will join the conversation after our presentation. What we've just heard from Ilya and Leonid is that propaganda has consequences. It's not clear whether Boris's plans to issue such a report played a role in his murder, but this possibility certainly can't be ruled out. I want to turn in this part of our presentation to our own report, Hiding in Plain Sight, Putin's War in Ukraine. As Fred Kemp mentioned at the outset, these reports reflect work that was conducted independently from each other. In fact, we were unaware of the efforts of Boris Nemtsov, unfortunately, until his assassination. But our teams reached a common conclusion. Putin led his nation into war against a peaceful neighbor and lied to his people. So as we outline key findings from our work, I want to remind everyone who's here to join our conversation and share your evidence of Russia's war in Ukraine using the hashtag #PutinAtWar. And to set the scene for our report, I want to turn to Vladimir Putin and his own.
Finally, you asked whether our troops are present in Ukraine. I can tell you very clearly there are no Russian troops in Ukraine.
I can tell you very clearly there are no Russian troops in Ukraine. This is Vladimir Putin lying to his people. In response to allegations of Russian involvement in Ukraine, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said earlier this year, if you allege this so confidently, present the facts. But nobody can present the facts, he said, or nobody wants to. So before demanding from us that we stop doing something, please present proof that we have done it. And when the U.S. government did this, he retorted with a reply that these are just images from computer games. Russian government officials have sought to discredit information released by NATO or the U.S. government as a smear campaign. It's been part of a concerted propaganda campaign. It's hybrid warfare to sow confusion and encourage or justify ambivalence in the West's response to the conflict. Yet the evidence, as we've heard from our colleagues, is simply hiding in plain sight. So we thought the best antidote to this misinformation is simply to show the truth. So we took Minister Lavrov up on his challenge to present the facts. And what we've also produced is in a body of research here, we've produced it for a more compelling reason. If the international community can't distinguish fact from fiction, or chooses not to do so in public, it's unlikely to coalesce around an effective strategy both to support Ukraine and to deter Mr. Putin. This report is our effort to offer some clarity. We set out to tell the true story of Russia's war in Ukraine. This is no civil war. Rather, it's a story of regular Russian soldiers readied for combat at improvised bases along the Russian-Ukrainian border, backed by a steady flow of arms and equipment, and at times supported by cross-border artillery shelling. Our report documents each of these four pillars, each of these four elements. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn to my colleagues, Max Jupersky and Alina Polyakova, who will share one example of each of these to underscore the findings of our investigation. We make this case using only open source, all unclassified material, and none of it provided by government sources. And it's thanks to the work that's been pioneered by human rights defenders and our partner Elliot Higgins, we've been able to use social media forensics and geolocation to back this up. I want to turn to our own tech-savvy Max to offer a word about the methodology.
Thank you, Damon. Everyone shares. People share pictures from their family trip. People share pictures from the fun time that they have out at night, but they also share pictures from convoys driving through their towns. And we took that curiosity and we matched it up together with the geotags that nowadays are on social media posts. We then used a method called geolocation to cross-verify the geotags. And I'm now going to turn over to Elliot Higgins, who will tell you how we prove that a post was made in a certain location by using geolocation.
This video is from a town called Zurez. This is earlier on in the route, and unusually with this one, the person who posted this online gave us the time and the coordinates. So we actually put the coordinates into Google Earth, which you can see here. We kind of rotated the image to make it a bit easier, and then we went through different elements you could see and matched it off. So there's various structures that are visible, and you can see the road layout as well.
There's enough to identify in here to completely match it up.
That's correct.
So as you can see, we match up the posts that people post online with the geolocation information, the geotag, so to speak, and we then go and geolocate that post to really verify that we actually right on that post. So with that, we were able to track military equipment in Russia and follow its path to Ukraine. In one instance, we found a howitzer in Russia near the town of Rostov. An ordinary citizen posted it online. A few weeks later, we saw the same very howitzer all the way just out in the outskirts of Mariupol being caught in an Al Jazeera clip. So you can literally match it like a fingerprint, and you have undeniable proof that there is a Russian military equipment crossing the border. But just the way you're able to trace equipment, you're also able to trace people who post pictures of themselves, including soldiers. So one of the soldiers that we followed on his journey is Boris Nemtsov. We traced his path all the way back to his home region of Buryatia on the Russian-Mongolian border. I'm now going to turn over to Alina Polyakova, who will tell you more about how we then followed his trip. Alina?
Thank you, Max. So from Buryatia, where Bato lives, he traveled 3,000 miles to the eastern Ukrainian border to a training camp near the Russian city of Kuzminka. Training camps such as these have become the launching sites and staging points as the Kremlin prepares for its combat in Ukraine. And now anybody with access to just Google Earth can see that these camps are brand new. So for example, Kuzminki, the camp that I just described, this is what it looked like in 2013, complete empty space. Now just 1 year later, this is what Kuzminki, the camp, looks like now. We see mass buildup of military equipment, barracks, equipment ready to be deployed for the war in eastern Ukraine. And we know that Bato Dambai was there. He took this photo of himself with a husky puppy, and he posted this social media webpage. Now from Kuzminki, we know that Bato was then deployed for fighting in the Donbass. And he traveled all the way from Kuzminki to Debaltseve in February 2015. And it was at this very checkpoint, to these exact coordinates, that we can trace Bato, because he posted a photo of himself again on his Kontakte page. So this is Bato. This is from a social media page. And the coordinates of this are geolocated exactly to the checkpoint I just pointed out. Now, Bato was lucky enough to return home to Buryatia, where he has a wife and a 2-year-old son. But many Russian soldiers, as we also heard earlier, have not been so lucky. And indeed, many return home in zinc coffins under the label of Cargo 200. Damon.
Thank you, Alina. So Max and Alina have just illustrated how Russia is at war in Ukraine. Russian citizens and soldiers are dying and fighting in a war of their government's own making. Indeed, Russian forces throughout the conflict have played key defining roles at key moments, from Little Green Men in Crimea to the annexation, to seeding the first violent uprising in Slavyansk, to appointing the political leadership, including a known FSB colonel, to attempting to trigger uprisings from Odessa to Kharkiv in an effort to create Novorossiya. And when that failed, deploying the Chechen Vostok Battalion and amassing troops along the border in advance of Ukraine's historic presidential election on May 25th, just a year ago. And yet it was then, despite that, where Ukrainian forces began to take back territory. And Russia responded to this effort where the Ukrainians almost took back their territory by sending in ever more sophisticated equipment, artillery, tanks, anti-aircraft missiles, including the Buk surface-to-air missile system that we heard about from Leonid, the one that shot down the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 on July 17th. And in response to Ukraine's counteroffensive, Russia resorted to artillery strikes from Russian territory, attacking Ukrainian forces on Ukrainian territory. To document this, let's turn again to Elliot.
What we were looking into were artillery attacks that were reported in the summer of 2014 against Ukrainian forces near the Russian border. There are of these attacks coming from Russia, but there was no real solid proof. So we wanted to see if there was anything behind these claims. What we have here is satellite map imagery from Ukraine. So one thing that's very useful about Google Earth is they buy imagery from different dates. So you can actually go back in time and see what areas looked like at different times of the year. And if we look at the July 16th imagery, which is available freely to anyone on Google Earth, we can actually see these crater fields. And this relates to a reported attack a few days earlier. We examined the craters and figured out the trajectory, and we did this by using established techniques used by militaries across the world, based off the marks on the ground. So what we were able to do was find the average trajectory, and that gave us a bearing that we followed back into Russia, where we found signs of launch sites inside Russia. We can see positions where multiple rocket launchers would have been parked. When these things fire, they leave quite a significant amount of burning in areas where there's crops and grass. And there's only so many vehicles this could be, and many of them in service with the Russian military. So by examining the markings on the ground, we were able to determine the wheelbase of some of these vehicles. And based on the way they were turning, we could calculate that it was likely going to be a Gradle Tornado multiple rocket launcher. We then could overlay that on the site, and we could get a good idea where all the vehicles were positioned and which way they were firing. And this just happened to be pointing exactly to the crater sites inside Ukraine. In fact, in some cases, we were able to find examples where the launches had actually been filmed by people inside Russia. So, for example, we've got videos where there's the smoke from launches. Some videos, there's even the launches actually as they were happening. And these videos were all posted on by individuals on different social media accounts. So we know they're from people, different sources, and they were filmed from different locations inside Russia. And what's useful about that is it's actually possible to then find exactly where each video was filmed using a technique we call geolocation, where we use images visible in the video to match it to imagery on the ground. It was possible not only to find the satellite map imagery that matched the reports of the attack, but also videos showing the attack actually happening, filmed by people inside Russia. What we've managed to establish is there were a number of significant gains made by the Ukrainian separatists in the summer of 2014. Many of these sites where there's huge crater fields that have been linked to sites in Russia appear to be linked to those gains. So it does seem that these cross-border artillery attacks, they weren't random acts. The suggestion is that these attacks were part of an organized offensive supported by artillery attacks from inside Russia.
Yet after that attack, Ukraine's counteroffensive continued into August. And it was by mid-August, when Ukrainian forces were on the verge of taking over the smaller enclaves at the time of Donetsk and Lugansk, that regular Russian forces in the thousands poured across to soundly defeat at that time, Ukraine's military. Russia stepped in to assist the so-called separatists when the Ukrainian forces were on the verge of wiping them out. So despite the Minsk ceasefire that then followed that in early September, Russia's resupply continued unabated. Russian-led offensive began to take the airport in Donetsk in December, as you'll recall from those vivid images. And then the effort towards Debaltseve began, a critical railway junction between Donetsk and Lugansk. And it was which led to Minsk II, but it was between the two Minsk agreements when Russian forces captured an additional 500 square kilometers of territory in Ukraine. Indeed, it was only after the February 15th Minsk agreement that the forces took Debaltseve. And since the Minsk II agreement, which is underway right now, we've seen stepped-up heavy fighting just as of the past 24 hours. If you look at our Ambassador Pyatt's Twitter account, you'll see live video footage of that. But also the capture of up to an additional 28 villages and towns during the so-called ceasefire. So what do we conclude from all of our work and our looking at this? And the report will go through each one of these areas in far more detail with many more examples. But if you step back, for us, first, there would be no conflict in Ukraine today but for Putin's strategy to provoke one. We don't have a Ukraine problem, we have a Putin problem. Second, the best antidote to this misinformation, hybrid war, is clarity. It's simply speaking the truth. To do otherwise only reinforces Putin's attempt to obfuscate Russia's direct role in the conflict. And that means Western leaders must counter, not abet, Russia's hybrid war with our own language, with what we say. After all, these are a prerequisite for policies that can better deter Russia's aggression. Third, the thing that I've really learned in this process through my colleagues is that social media forensics and geolocation analysis, it's a powerful tool. It's a democratization of intelligence gathering. Information once available only to intelligence agencies is now literally hiding in plain sight for anyone to see. And this matters because it's helped us overcome differences among intelligence assessments as we've seen around the NATO table. It's overcome some of the healthy skepticism among our publics about intelligence after spectacular intelligence failures in the past. You don't need to believe any official. You don't need to believe us. You need to actually take a look yourself. So it's a tool that's out there that we actually don't control. It's a new reality in a world in which individuals and non-state actors can really play a critical role. But fourth, in our view, I think this report serves as a bit of a warning. What's coming next in Ukraine? We're not certain, but we have seen a pattern in which Russia has used the lull in fighting to prepare for a next phase of conflict. And what may be happening is Putin's creating the reality of a separate fighting force so that he can more effectively distance regular Russian forces from the conflict and make the case, if full fighting begins again, that this really is a civil war, regardless of its origins. It is peculiar that now the separatists have more tanks than France, Germany, and Italy combined. We shouldn't fall into the trap of ever thinking this is a civil war. It's also a warning of the impact of what is happening across Europe and Eurasia today. The power of Russia's hybrid war isn't limited to Ukraine. We see a concerted effort to use propaganda, misinformation, and hybrid tactics to like Moldova, Georgia, Kazakhstan, to prevent the inexorable move of some of these countries to the west, as well as what we see playing out in the Western Balkans. But most dangerously, we see some of these tactics aimed at NATO allies and European Union members to divide them by exploiting divisions within our nations and among our allies, and perhaps an ultimate goal of undermining the solidarity that's at the core of our alliance. So therefore, we conclude this with a couple of points that we hope that these reports, that these two reports, that they encourage policymakers to really draw on these insights to inform the decisions that they're taking. to take off the table discussion of curtailing the sanctions and confirm the extension of these sanctions underway on Russia until the behavior is reversed. And perhaps more so to galvanize a more comprehensive transatlantic strategy on how to support Ukraine and deter Russia's aggressive actions. But we do have to remember that Putin has used this crisis first and foremost, as we've heard from our colleagues today, to consolidate his own authority at home, whipping up patriotic sentiment to paper over some of the Kremlin's own failures in governance, and therefore unmasking this deception to his own people, as our colleagues are doing, is a key part of the strategy of hitting back on aggression. And finally, I think we also must remember for us that it's the important takeaway to demonstrate a sense of solidarity with those Russians who are courageous enough to take a stand against the line of the government. It's easy for those of us outside of Russia to do this, but Ilya, Leonid, Sergei, Natalia, they put their own selves at risk by paying tribute to Boris Nemtsov by completing his work. It's a reminder that the first victims of Putin are the people of Russia who deserve so much better. And as Fred began our conversation today, for so long, so many of us associated with the Atlantic Council have worked toward this vision of a Europe whole and free in which Russia would find its peaceful place, its rightful place. And I think while that goal remains further away today than a few years ago, it remains a compelling vision for the future. So thank you very much. We now want to be able to move into a conversation with our guests. So as my colleagues change the stage here, I just want to, for a moment, we're going to be moderated by Susan Glasser, who has joined us. We're going to now shift into this conversation. And Susan Glasser is just a terrific colleague. As most of you know, she's the editor of Politico right now. She was the founding editor of Politico magazine, previously having served as editor-in-chief at Foreign Policy, where she had a tremendous record of relaunching its print edition and beginning its daily online magazine. She spent a decade with the Washington Post as a foreign correspondent and editor and a political reporter. And she and her husband, Peter Baker, spent 4 years as co-chiefs of the Post's Moscow bureau during Putin's first term, where the two of them authored Kremlin's Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the End of the Revolution. She had a remarkable start to her career as an intern at Roll Call, where she went from being intern to top editor. It's a delight to have you here, Susan, with us today. We're really pleased you're going to do this. Please join me on stage, and I'll invite our colleagues and presenters and Ambassador John Herbst to join as well, who's been the driving force of the Atlantic Council's work. Thank you. Please, Yashin. Yes, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Damon, thank you so much. I didn't pay him for that introduction, so, next time you need to be introduced, go for Damon. I want to thank everyone on this panel for really an extraordinary presentation today, and of course to the Atlantic Council for hosting us. It's really tremendous to see the powers as a journalist, to see what an independent think tank is able to do at this moment in time. It's hard to imagine going back in time were this the Soviet Union, what Kremlinology would have looked like had we had some of these tools available to us. Of course, having worked in Moscow, as Damon said, it's very sad in many ways that the reason for the report would be, and the wide attention that it will receive, Ilya, is because of the death of Boris Nemtsov, who I knew well and worked with in Moscow, of course. But I thought we should just jump right in and start with something that Damon finished his presentation with, which is, what is the rationale behind this secrecy? Why, in this day and age, have a secret war even in the first place? Ambassador Herbst, I'm curious what you make of all of this. It seems, given how factually easy it is to disprove, it seems almost odd that Russia would choose to pursue this course of secrecy.
There are two large reasons why Mr. Putin's conducting a quote-unquote secret war in Ukraine. One was addressed by our colleagues from Russia, which is that the Russian people are strongly against the use of Russian military in Ukraine. So in order to sustain his position at home, Mr. Putin cannot admit to his people the aggression he's committing against Slavic brothers. That's reason one. Reason two, Mr. Putin claims that he is strong and can choose what he wants. But in fact, he understands that there's much greater power in the West, in the United States and Europe. So he wants to conduct the war in such a way that people in Europe, and for that matter in this town, don't have to pay attention to the fact that there's a war. Because if they acknowledge that there's a war and they see it plainly the way we try and present it here, that would require strong policies to oppose it. So he's playing both to Western weakness and the strong feelings of his own people against war in Ukraine. That's why he pursues these policies, and in fact, they have served him well.
What do you make of the recent reports that there is a new massing on the border of Russian military strength? Do you think that we're headed for another offensive? Do you have any indication, any of you on that?
I think it's highly likely that we will not see a major Russian offensive, at least not until Europe decides once again this summer on sanctions. It serves Mr. Putin well to destabilize the government in Kiev by seizing small increments of land in Ukraine's east. That prevents the government in Ukraine from focusing on reform, on the one hand, and it does not cross a threshold which might provoke stronger Western response.
Sergei, just today, the State Department came out and had a statement on a new Russian law that would continue to keep secret any Russian military casualties that are happening in peacetime. This seems like a fairly transparent effort to stop reports like your report, like the Nemtsov report, and to continue to make it very difficult to confirm the Russian military presence in Ukraine. Do you think that people understand what is going on with a law like that in the Duma? Have you found it very hard for Russians to get them to talk about these deaths, or are they succeeding in covering it up?
You are very correct in this question, and I have to prevent all of you that all we are talking today about Russian casualties in eastern Ukraine is under Russian secrecy. It's classified information. So please do not bring those reports in Russia. You may be punished and persecuted. And that's it. That's not a joke, unfortunately. And that is not a law. I have to precise. It is the decree signed by President Putin, so it was not approved by the Duma according to the legislation. That's his authority. It's a funny story with this decree because on the one hand, there is no definition what does it mean special operations, because decree says the information on casualties of Russian troops during special operations is classified. But in the law there is no such a term, so we don't know what is classified information. Second, if it is a secret operation, a special operation in Ukraine with the use of Russian military troops, this should be approved by the Federation Council, by the upper chamber of the Russian parliament. That was not done. So I seriously do not believe that this decree will be used against us, against Russian mass media who have understanding of the legislation, who have rather good lawyers and who has support in the public opinion. I think that is a decree to make fear for ordinary Russian people, for the relatives of those young men who are losing their lives in Ukraine, who are losing who are casualties, and in fact, we know very well that at the moment authorities just bribing them. They pay them amount from $1 to $2 or $3 million, 3 million rubles per each person, and people kept silent. They forget about their sons, about their husbands, about their brothers, and it's a painful story. But we believe that if this war continues and if the number of casualties is growing, of course it will not be possible to hide this information, and this decree will be used as an instrument to prevent people to disperse information, to share their knowledge, just for ordinary people, but not for mass media.
Mm-hmm. Ilya, was it very difficult to get the information into the report from the different soldiers' families? Were people willing to cooperate?
It was very difficult because the people are scared very much. Nemtsov was started to work with his families, and we print Nemtsov's записка, I don't know how to say it in English. Note, yes, Nemtsov's note. It's in our report. He made this note just maybe 1 week before his murder. Trying to find an English version, it's more difficult than in Russian. He made this note by his hand because he was afraid that it's someone can listen, and he made a note. There are 17 families of Russian soldiers who were killed in Ukraine asked me to help, but they scared to talk. Scared to talk. And that was true, because we started to work with these sources by Nemtsov.
So you had access to the sources, to the families?
Yes, we called them, these people, we met with them, and the problem was, the problem with these soldiers was before they go into Ukraine, the generals asked them to fire from army formally. Just to, if they will get or dead in Ukraine, formally, they are not soldiers. And generals, commanders told them that if something will happen with you, your families will get the money as a compensation. And that was lie. The people dead, the soldiers were killed, and families didn't get money. And they asked Nemtsov and other politicians to help to pressure on the Ministry of Defense to get this money. And that's why these people, these families, called to Nemtsov. But they was really scared to tell this in public. And how do you can imagine that after Nemtsov's murder, they didn't become more brave. But we call with these families, we collect the information, and we use the information in this report. Yes, thank you, Sergey. This is Nemtsov's notes, made by his hands, scared to talk.
Speaking of fear and intimidation, I wonder if you can update us with what you know about your colleague Vladimir Karamurza, who has reportedly been poisoned and who also had been working with Nemtsov and
that Nemtsov was the крестный отец.
Godfather.
Godfather of Karamurza's daughter. They was really close. They was really close, and Karamurza, it was just personal drama, personal tragedy for Karamurza about Nemtsov's murder. You know, for many people, for millions of people in Russia, in all over the world, it was personal tragedy. But for Vladimir Karamurza, it was really, really personal tragedy, because they were really close.
And he is in the hospital now and is poisoned.
Yes, he's in a Moscow hospital, and the medical staff from Israel came to Moscow, and they're trying to understand, is it possible to transportate Karamurza from Moscow to Israel clinic? But we still have no information about this. They said just that he's in a critical situation, because all his body completely full of poison, and his organs stopped to work, and he's just now in medical coma. And I don't know what to say. It's crazy, because it's many people believe that after Nemtsov's murder, for long time it's be safe in opposition, because they are not crazy, and after Nemtsov's murder they will stop all this aggression, and now we have an answer to this question.
The initial information from this Israeli doctor is that Vladimir, if it happens, it's no occasion, took a strange combination of multiple medicines altogether. So that's the medical effect of what's going on with his body, with his. It's very strange.
Yeah, the first it was bad yogurt.
Bad yogurt.
Bad
yes.
yogurt. Yes.
Avoid yogurt at all costs. I guess that's the thing. No, it's an extraordinary moment. Again, it's so unusual to have these multiple poisonings. Of course, this has happened not once but more than once in recent years. What do you think? Was there anything? I want to ask everyone this actually. What was the most surprising thing that you learned in doing this report? Some fact or information, something that you didn't expect to know in this? Damon, do you want to start?
In part, I was surprised by actually how much is out there. And part of that is actually the problem, because as you see, there's so much on social media that if you do Twitter and Instagram and you are active on these social media platforms, you'll see a lot of trolls. You'll see a lot of reaction to anything about Ukraine that sort of presents an opposite perspective. Images of so-called Ukrainian fascist forces, the famous story of crucifying a young boy. So there's a lot out there which is a tactic to sort of blur the picture, muddy the waters, and flood the space. And so if you're looking, how do you know what's real, what's not real? It's, yeah, there are a lot of images out there that look like Russian forces are in Ukraine, but there's a lot else out there. And so what struck me was how much was out there in such a way that you could actually begin to systematically peel that back. You could actually begin to systematically sift through that and be able to piece together completely independent, separate pieces of information to begin to verify and corroborate. And it takes this muddiness of everything you see, the chatter, the noise on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and it was the ability to actually take pieces to underscore the facts that Russian forces were there. And that was, frankly, quite a bit of a learning curve for me. We've got a pretty savvy social media team here, but this whole process sort of took it to a new level.
Sergey, what did you learn that you didn't expect to learn from these reports?
Following Damon, I would not like to repeat that nothing can be hidden at the moment. So in the current world, you cannot hide. Being the very powerful state, you cannot hide information. So everything will be evident. But I was really surprised after the report was published, because I stay here in Washington, and during 10 days, I was receiving 3 to 4 calls from all over the world. Please help us to understand. Explain us how you got your conclusion, how you work on these reports, starting from Washington, New York, London, Paris, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and many other cities in Russia. And sometimes I never visited those cities. I didn't know about their existence, but people called me and found me. And that was the interest in the Russian society, in the international community, on this report, on its conclusion, how trusted it can be. That was most impressive for me.
May I just give you a couple of words? When we made the first presentation in Moscow, it was about 200 journalists, and it was 42 telecameras. And how do you think, how many cameras was from Russia? From these 42 cameras? 2.
And did they show a report?
Yes,
based on
only 2.
Ambassador Herbst.
I'm not sure that anything became newly evident to me as a result of this report, although I agree with Damon that the amount of information is staggering. But what hits home is the fact that despite all this information, despite these new efforts and these reports, there still is a large group of doubters. And I think that has a lot to do with their own psychological state of mind. They don't want to accept the unpleasant reality of a major nation at war in Europe. And that's the reality we have to bring home to them so that we can adopt the right, proper responses.
Damon, you served inside the U.S. government at a time when we didn't really have as widely democratized these tools. Obviously, I think there was some version of this that the intelligence agencies had. Why has the U.S. government, or European governments for that matter, why have they not been more aggressive, do you think, in presenting this information? Why, there's been reports, of course, that Secretary Kerry has privately shown evidence. NATO headquarters has released various photos at various times. They have not produced anything like this. Why is that, do you think?
There are a couple factors. I mean, first, you have to remember that we really did have a resource issue when I was in government. I was confronted with the reality that we really made a commitment of priorities to move intel assets more towards the Middle East, Afghanistan. We had a very different perspective of the relationship we were building with Russia. And so it's sometimes assumed that we had everything. And I think it's important to remember how we prioritized our resources because of where we thought we were going in Russia and the challenges we were facing elsewhere. The second part is I have a lot of sympathy. I've talked to many of my colleagues who are working these issues, and the ability to release anything from, particularly if it does come from classified sources, is pretty torturous. And so you can miss the bubble, you miss the news cycle. And so I think the administration, I think General Breedlove, I think NATO headquarters has actually done a pretty good job of putting out information, of making the case and retorting. But what we've also seen is that there's a jaded public. These are government sources. We've gone through the Iraq experience. And there is some value to this not being from the U.S. government or not being from that matter. So I think they've made good strides towards that. But I think they also recognize that there is the power to have of independent voices to speak out on these issues.
I feel like Ambassador Herbst wants to say something on this point.
I'll add only one point. I think if you consider what's happening in Ukraine to be only a regional crisis, you don't want to help bring information out publicly which contradicts that. And if you understand what's happening in Ukraine, in fact, is an example of one of the world's two great nuclear powers wanting to rewrite the political order, so a global crisis of the first order. If you don't understand that, you will not put forward the effort you need. So I think we see an absence of clarity on the fact side, which mirrors an insufficient policy on the policy side.
I do want to make sure we get to questions. Everyone's been so patient here. So if you have your questions in mind, we have some microphones here in the room. Please identify yourself, and please make sure it's a question. Thank you, so we can get to as many people as possible. Sir, on the end there.
Quickly, could you talk?
Can you tell us who you are?
Garth Trinkle, Washington, D.C., Independent. My question is for the two U.S. citizens on the panel, with all respect for the others. Did something happen in August of last year during the Russian military offensive in eastern Ukraine that was not as well captured by the tools of geolocation and the forensic Sherlock Holmes? There seems to be, you have 4 points in your study, and then there seems to be a little bit of a gap at the most important Russian push into eastern Ukraine. Thank you.
You want me to take it?
Sure. There was definitely a very massive Russian offensive operation during that time, between mid-July and August. And I'm afraid what we saw in the presentation, mostly of our Atlantic Council report, is evidences from the social networks. When it is massive offensive, soldiers, they have no time to make pictures, selfies, and so on. They're worried with some other problems. So I think it's much less information of this type you may find in social network. Second, I appreciate efforts of our colleagues because it's very resource consuming. You underestimate, yes, there is a lot of information in social networks, but you need a lot of time, a lot of staff, a lot of money to discover all those facts. So if you are ready to provide some money, we are ready to continue our investigation.
And to check it.
Okay. Let's get some more questions. All the way in the back, ma'am.
Yeah.
Hello. Maria Morton, I have a question for Mr. Yashin. Я по-русски спрошу.
Wow.
You said that you want to appeal to the Russian society. I would like to know, what do you think? What is the situation with the Russian society today? You know it better. You live in Russia, work in Russia. Today I saw a picture, the polling about Nemtsov on social media, where they asked, do you feel sorry for Nemtsov? This is a very emotional question. 2,000 people said no, about 500 didn't say anything, about 2,000 said yes. I would like to know why it happens. Where those tendencies in the society, whether is that the result of propaganda on TV, or there are other reasons? I am very grateful and thank you for your work. Thank you for your question, and I will answer in Russian if you allow me. The Russian society is in a very difficult psychological condition. Political lobbies saying that this is a post-imperial syndrome. This is something like phantom pain, when a person loses a hand and sometimes that hand still hurts after it is being amputated. The Russian society probably has the same feeling as a result of losing the empirical feeling. And a lot of our citizens feel this pain because they feel that a huge country was taken away from them. And Putin is playing subtly on these sentiments of our citizens, and he gives this information to them that there is an empire, and somebody took away that empire. But Putin does not recreate this empire. Putin is very aggressive, but at the same time, for Putin, there are only two values: power and money. We have, Sergei and I have Andrei Piatkovsky, who is our colleague, our ally, a Russian oppositionist. He is very clear in his characteristic of the Putin regime. I can only sign his words, under his words. Putin wants to rule as Stalin, but live as Abramovich, like Abramovich lives today, a billionaire. As to the Russian society, the Russian society is traumatized, and Putin continues to make the repetition of this trauma. And for us, it is important to counter this lie. Even his allies who see these lies, they are disappointed in him. And regardless of all these pollings and all negative trends in the Russian society, for us it is very important to show the Russian society a civilized alternative. And we believe that this alternative can be attractive for the Russian society. The alternative is a civilized European state which is not feared of, but is respected. That's something that Nemtsov wanted to do.
Not underestimate the historical heritage. Historically, the price of human life in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in Tsarist Russia, was negligible, next to nothing. That's why in the Second World War, Russia, the Soviet Union, has lost, we don't know how much, 25, 27, maybe 30 million people, and nobody is worried, trying to understand this figure, to precise it. Yeah, and that's the issue. That's the issue. People are not worried. One man died. What's the problem? Who is Nemtsov? I never heard about him. I forgot. Yeah, I saw him 20 years ago. He died. He was killed. What's the problem? That's it. Unfortunately, that's the historical heritage as well.
Thank you. Now, we're almost out of time, so we have time for hopefully a couple more questions at most. I have one here up in the front.
Thank you, Temuri Yakubashvili. Congratulations on the terrific report, but we all know that publishing report is not enough. You have to disseminate. How you are going to do it? Both, actually, Nemtsov report and Atlantic Council report.
Thank you.
So thanks to many of you, if you're using hashtag #PutinAtWar, before we walked into this room, we were at 29 million Twitter impressions because of the advanced promotion around the release of both of these reports. You in this room are quite committed to this, but you're a small audience. We're aiming for, obviously, a much, much larger audience. So given this is drawn on social media, we've gone on offense on social media. Working with our Russian colleagues, we actually created the #PutinAtWar hashtag, launched it on the same day as the Moscow release of the Nemtsov report, as a way both to galvanize more evidence for folks to share more evidence of that hashtag, but also to begin a dissemination process for both. At the same time, ours is being translated into Russian. We'll be following up with a conference in Berlin a rollout in Poland, trying to hit a series of targeted areas. We've been requested already to prepare another one in French. So our team, I'm going to look at Max and Alina, have been really on offense, sort of pushing this out. We've got more work to do because I think that point is exactly right. We want to have an English language area here. I think the bigger challenge is hitting a Russian-speaking audience is one that we've been working on, and I'll defer to my colleagues to pick that up.
Yeah, Ilya, can you tell us, or Sergey, a little bit about how well distributed your report is inside Russia today?
Now we print the small number of our report. It's about only 2,000, and it's just for presentations in Russian cities. We made a presentation in Moscow, 2 presentations. We made a presentation in St. Petersburg, and we made the presentations in 2 cities very important for Boris Nemtsov. In Nizhny Novgorod, Nemtsov was the first democratically elected, the governor of Nizhny Novgorod region. And we made a presentation in Yaroslavl. Nemtsov was elected as a member of the local parliament in Yaroslavl region. But we have a big plans. We're going to organize a presentation in Chelyabinsk, in Novosibirsk, in Kostroma, in Cheboksary. And in this period, we're trying to collect money in internet to print the big number of this report. Now we collected about 1 million rubles. In these 2 weeks, we collected about 2 million rubles, and we believe that we can collect more. We have problems, to be honest, with this work. For example, the PayPal has blocked our account and do not work with us because of political reasons. They send us a message that we're sorry, but we don't want to take part in political projects of Russian opposition. Sorry. But we still continue this job with this work, and finally we will print it, and we will go to Russian society. We would like to start the big national discussion, and we have no alternative just to go to Russian streets, go to Russian factories, go to Russian squares, and just shake million hands, just talk to people like Nemtsov did, like other political activists in Russia did. And we believe that if we make this work complete, the situation in Russia could be changed.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. I want to thank everyone here for coming today and all of these authors for these extraordinary reports.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.